This is Townsquare Sunday on 1420 WBSM, the place where people come together to talk about the good things happening in and around New Bedford.
Come together right now. Oh.
And now, the moderator of Townsquare Sunday, Jim Phillips.
Thanks once again for tuning in, and welcome to Townsquare Sunday. I'm your host, Jim Phillips, and we're again turning the spotlight on the charter school issue in New Bedford, and perhaps a much larger issue as well, the need for more funding for the city's public schools. My guest has been at the forefront of those issues in recent weeks and months. Ricardo Rosa co-chairs the New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools. He attended a meeting this week with the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. That board approved a plan to add 450 charter seats in the city of New Bedford. The Alma Del Mar Charter School will take over the vacant Kempton School in the West End, pay for repairs, and open the new school in August with students from that general neighborhood rather than citywide. Mr. Rosa, first off, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with a very basic question here, because some people just may not know what the Coalition to Save Our Schools is. Who's involved? Why was it formed?
Right. The coalition, the New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools, was actually formed in 2012. When we initially formed, it was the Southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island Coalition to Save Our Schools. And we recently changed the name in order to deal with local issues. Particularly, we changed the name as a result of this proposal to expand charter school seats in New Bedford. And we felt the need to really hone in on the local rather than regional. It was formed again in 2012. It's a grassroots organization comprised of families, comprised of young people, comprised of educators. And all of the decisions are made by the members of the organization. Although I am the co-chair, we have a steering committee. The steering committee basically acts to deepen the decisions that the entire membership comes to.
And you, sir, we talked before going on the air. You are a UMass Dartmouth professor.
Correct.
And how long have you been doing that?
I've been at UMass Dartmouth since 2011.
All right. And you have also been a substitute teacher
Right.
in New Bedford Public Schools.
Right. I occasionally substitute in New Bedford Public Schools. I feel that it's very important for me as a professor of education to have my finger on the pulse of what's going on locally. And so I feel that it makes me a better teacher of my students, basically. I work with educational leaders and teachers.
Let's focus on the charter school issue for a moment. In your view, in the coalition's view, what's wrong with the Alma Del Mar expansion? And I ask the question because, after all, they were looking for 1,200 seats.
Correct.
And they get less than half of that. In fact, some people in New Bedford claim it's a victory. We are getting a lot less seats than they had originally proposed.
Right.
The other charter school, it was denied 100 seats,
Correct.
Global Learning, and the other charter school's on probation.
Correct.
So, what's wrong with this proposal? What's wrong with this picture? Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, let's begin with the picture, first of all. Let me just say that I'm not a proponent of charter schools. You know, I feel that it's a moral issue, first of all. And so this idea that we can we can improve public school systems by chartering off a piece of our public school system is just egregious. You know, I think any siphoning of resources from public schools leads to their destruction, their collapse. So I have a lot of problems with charter schools as a concept. I think that it's really about, attacking labor. It's really about, that's a major issue for me. And across the nation, charter schools have been structures that have been created for the purposes of a whole lot of real estate wheeling and dealing and sort of moving wealth from communities, to the ruling elite. And I have a lot of problems with that. With this particular proposal, I see it, again, I don't see it as a compromise at all. I see this as highly destructive. You're talking about the creation of a structure in Massachusetts that's unprecedented, You're talking about, first of all, the community not being involved in the process, this deal being cut behind closed doors, despite the fact that on November 27th, our coalition actually held a forum at Keith Middle School, and we had over 400 participants articulating their resistance against any charter school expansion whatsoever in the city. And this deal is cut behind closed doors, not involving the community. So when we say that our leaders were involved, the fact of the matter is that we have community leaders. We have an entire group of that was shut out of this process. And so I find that to be very egregious. And like I said, this model is unprecedented in Massachusetts. You know, somebody came in the air not too long ago equating this model to New Orleans and stating that, that's the only place in the nation where he saw this model being similar. And he compared it to Lesotho in South Africa. It's like Lesotho, sort of South Africa. And the insinuation is South Africa makes policies and it affects Lesotho, which is a smaller entity within a larger entity. Well, in New Orleans, we don't have that. In New Orleans, there is no competition. Charter schools are the only schools that exist. There are no more public schools. So that is the reality of New Orleans, and that is likely the reality of what's to come. So if this expansion happens, we're looking at additional expansions. We're looking at additional sort of blurring of the public and private, which is extremely dangerous for our city.
What we don't know, as you've said, this is unprecedented. We don't really know how it will work. Right. The funding process for charter schools has always been a concern for the coalition. Right. What the coalition says is, well, they're taking money out of the public school budget.
Correct.
The charters say, and you've heard this too, I'm sure, well, the money just follows the child, that's all. Mm-hmm. You get so much money per child who goes to charter school, and it's not like we're taking, more than that. The money follows the child. Do you have a reason to believe there's holes in that reasoning?
Well, I mean, there are holes. I mean, the money follows the child, but let's be clear. The money follows the child into a private, arrangement. You're talking about schools that are unaccountable to school committees, unaccountable to superintendents. And you're talking about schools that are actually unaccountable to their own families, because a lot of these schools, including Alma, I mean, they have board members that are not, family members, so the community actually has very little input into what goes on into them. So you're talking about structures that are totally different than public schools. When we put our tax dollars into schools, I mean, we like to have some say regarding how these schools operate. And charter schools just don't allow for that to happen. So it's highly problematic. Any siphoning of funds from public schools, again, is highly problematic. We have public schools that are performing just as well, if not better, than Alma de Mar. And when you siphon these funds out of these public schools, you're talking about the possibility of these programs being dismantled or being curtailed in a way where they don't function as positively as they once did.
So I know you oppose more charter school seats. So do we need a new method to fund charter schools?
Yeah, I don't think they should be, funded through, tax dollars, basically. I don't know what that would mean. I mean, do they become private schools? I just believe that this whole chartering process is detrimental, to our public school system. And if you look at, if you take, the number one school system in the world, let's say everybody touts Finland as being number one. And Finland is a country that had a tremendous amount of problems in their public school system. Finland is currently number one in terms of its outcomes, and it's a school system that has no charter schools. In fact, they have very few private schools. They have a few that are religious, but everybody's energy is invested in the public school system. Teachers are well paid. Teachers are treated as professionals. They make the same amount of money as doctors. You don't have high-stakes standardized testing in these schools. Teachers and administrators are part of the same union. You're talking about a school system that does diametrically, different things than the American public school system, and it's a success.
The legislature has been reluctant to change this formula. I mean, right. We've been talking about this for a long time,
right?
And the legislature has not done anything,
right,
really, to change the formula.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, I think, across the country, what you're seeing is sort of austerity being applied, right? You're seeing, these funding formulas being created for the purpose of creating crisis in the public realm. And when you create these crises, it becomes easier to sort of threaten public school systems with privatized models like charter schools. So the two go hand in hand, That's basically it. I think it's austerity applied so as to be able to push through things that wouldn't ordinarily be pushed through if those funds were there. Now, I also worried about this new funding model because if the new funding model speaks to increased accountability, I mean, teachers are already under a tremendous amount of pressure in terms of accountability, and in terms of sort of direct instruction and not being treated as professionals. We're talking about a system that, if the funding model is geared towards increased accountability, we're looking at increased problems in public schools. We also have this new structure in New Bedford, right? We have this new blurring of public and private. What does that mean in relation to the new funding model, right? Is there a mechanism that disallows increased funding, increased resources to be moved from public schools to these new models, this new arrangement with the charter school? We don't know that.
And I'm sure you don't agree that charters do a better job of educating New Bedford
Absolutely
students.
not. Absolutely not. I think that
they make that claim all the time.
They do make that claim, and the thing is that there are some charter schools that are exceptional, that are created by activists in the community, that are created by, families and so forth, and teachers who live locally. But the exceptional cannot be used to represent the movement as a whole. The charter school movement as a whole has been a disaster. They have not improved, education. They have not, there's a major report that came out of Stanford University called the Credo Report that shows us that charter schools are usually just as better, if not worse, than public school systems. So we need to take that seriously. And we also need to remember that usually the students that end up going to charter schools are students who come from families who, first of all, know the difference between a public school and a charter school. And these are students whose families tend to be more involved in the educational system, which means that those students tend to be better academically inclined than students who don't go to charter school. So even though these charter schools are sort of creaming from the top, they're getting students who are more academically inclined, and then you have the aggregate effect of leaving kids who are not as academically inclined in the public school system, right, which is dangerous. Even though these families are moving their kids to charter schools, the charter schools are still not performing, better in many cases than public school systems.
You're listening to Townsquare Sunday. My guest is Ricardo Rosa, co-chair of the New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools. Recently, the coalition joined school officials and education leaders from around the region, as you mentioned this earlier in November.
Correct.
What amounted to a rally, really, in support
That's right.
of full funding for public schools. How far are we away? What's the number we need to reach to do that in Massachusetts? It's got to be billions.
Right, it's got to be billions. But, I can speak to New Bedford right now because that's where my heart is, that's where my passion is. But New Bedford is underfunded by $40 million, every year. And so I like to see those funds revert or come back to the city. We don't have a lot of time to go through those calculations, but that's the coalition's figure, or is that that's the coalition's figure, and that's the figure that many city officials as well as state officials have been circulating.
That is a lot of money. How should that be spent in New Bedford to generate maximum? If we had it, right. On a plate, somebody gave
Excellent.
it to you. How can we spend that money to gain maximum results?
Great question. Well, first of all, I don't think that any of that money should be spent on sort of deepening high-stakes testing regimes, because this has been a failure in our schools. I don't think that schools should be, in terms of their organizational behavior, be held captive, to a high-stakes test or to test prep or to the buying of curriculum so as to get students to beat the test and so forth and so on. I see all of that as being very deviant, right? When we talk about deviance, when it comes to high-stakes testing, we usually focus on Atlanta or these cities where you have people taking tests and sort of doctoring them, erasing answers and well, that's one type of deviance. Another type of deviance is actually focusing on test prep, where the name of the game becomes to beat this high-stakes test. I don't see that as education. We should be doing education and not test prep in our schools. So I don't want to see any of that money go to these programs. I want to see that money go to wraparound services in schools, increased counselors, increased adjustment counselors, social workers, increases in nurses in schools, in providing students the social supports that they need. Because in the end, all of these outcomes in New Bedford or cities like New Bedford can be improved, right, if we handle sort of the social or the whole child, so to speak. So I like to see that in any funding structure that comes about. I like to also make certain that it's a participatory budget model where the community is fully at the table in terms of decision making regarding where the funds go.
Governor Baker has pledged to change the funding formula for public schools. Critics, however, say the plan will take too long. He's got a plan to spread $1.1 billion over 7 years.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, our young people cannot wait. In cities like New Bedford, in Brockton, Holyoke, and so forth and so on, the increased funding is something that needs to happen tomorrow. We don't need a 7-year process. We need it now.
How can the public help bring this issue to the forefront, Mr. Rosa?
Well, I think the public needs to really organize. Our New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools has become very active. We have a number of families that continue to join. I would say certainly reach out to our organization or any other organization, but the reality is that unless communities are organized, unless there are social movements on the ground, I mean, a lot of these city officials, these state officials are not going to pursue policies in the interest of the public. It's very important for people to be aware of what's going on and hold elected officials' feet to the fire.
And where can people go to get more information about the coalition?
Well, we have a Facebook page. We also have our direct line is
Sure,
state the number? Our direct line is 774-992-9473. If you'd like additional information, if you'd like to join the coalition, we have meetings monthly. We have steering committee meetings weekly, and so people can be a full participant in this organization.
My guest has been Ricardo Rosa, co-chair of the New Bedford Coalition to Save Our Schools. Thank you, sir, for coming in.
You're very welcome.
And good luck.
Thank you, sir.
Townsquare Sunday continues in just one moment.